the sharp lines emphasizing his broad shoulders and confident stance. Guests surrounded him, offering warm congratulations and toasts to his new life with Charlotte, his stunning bride. And from one of the wealthiest families in the city. Their marriage was not just a union of two people but a merging of power, influence, and prestige. Ethan had worked tirelessly to reach this point. He had clawed his way up from nothing, building his fortune through sheer determination and an unrelenting drive to succeed. Tonight. But as he sipped his champagne and smiled for yet another photograph, he felt it, a hollow ache in his chest, as though something vital was missing. "Ethan, darling." Charlotte's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're miles away. What's on your mind?" He shook his head, forcing a smile. "Nothing at all. Just taking it all in." Charlotte leaned in. Looked so familiar. Her dark skin glowed under the soft lights, her hair tied back in a simple bun. Her face was older, more tired than he remembered, but there was no mistaking her. Naomi. But Ethan knew her better than anyone. He recognized the way she moved, the slight tilt of her head, the determined set of her jaw. Memories flooded his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Naomi laughing in their tiny apartment, her eyes sparkling with joy as they dreamed of a future together. Naomi holding his hand as he struggled to get his business off the ground. Her unwavering support the only thing keeping him going. And then, the memory he had tried so hard to forget, Naomi's tear-streaked face as he walked out the door, leaving her behind. To explain, to say something that would make this moment less unbearable. But before he could speak, Naomi's gaze shifted, and she took a step back. "I have work to do," she said, her voice cold. "Enjoy your wedding, Ethan." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, stunned and speechless. He wanted to go after her, to demand answers, but something in her tone stopped him. It was the same tone she had used the last time they spoke, the day he left her. A tone of finality. Ethan returned to his table, his mind reeling. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The pain in her eyes, the bitterness in her voice. As the evening came to an end and the guests began to leave, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't let this go. He needed to know the truth. About Naomi. About the baby. About everything. Little did he know. The answers he was seeking would shatter the carefully constructed life he had built and force him to confront the darkest parts of himself. The next morning, Ethan sat in his study. The remnants of the wedding celebration still lingering in the air. The faint scent of roses and champagne clung to his clothes, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Naomi. Her face, her voice, her swollen belly, it was all he could see every time he closed his eyes. He had spent the entire night replaying their brief conversation, trying to make sense of it. Why was she working as a waitress? Why hadn't she reached out to him? And most importantly, who was the father of her child? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let him rest. Driven by a mix of guilt and desperation, Ethan made a decision. He needed to see her again. He needed answers. Later that afternoon. And a few more occupied the worn-out booths along the walls. Ethan scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. Naomi was behind the counter. Her back to him as she poured coffee into a customer's cup. She looked different in the harsh light of the diner. Tired. Worn down. Her uniform was too big for her small frame. And her hair was pulled back in the same simple bun he had seen the night before. But even now, there was a quiet strength about her, a resilience that hadn't been there the last time they spoke. Ethan took a deep breath and walked toward her. "Naomi." She froze, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. Slowly, she turned to face him. For a moment, they just stared at each other. They walked in silence for a few minutes until they reached a small park nearby. Naomi sat down on a bench, her arms crossed over her chest. Ethan hesitated before sitting beside her. "Well?" she said, her voice sharp. "What do you want, Ethan?" He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I saw you last night," he began. At the wedding. And I couldn't stop thinking about you. About us. Naomi let out a bitter laugh. Us? There hasn't been us in years, Ethan. You made sure of that. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I know I hurt you. And I've regretted it every day since. She turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. Do you? Do you really regret it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got exactly what you wanted. A perfect life, a perfect wife, and a perfect wedding. Meanwhile, I'm here, working 2 jobs just to survive. Ethan flinched at her words. I didn't know, he said softly. I didn't know things were so hard for you. Of course, you didn't, Naomi snapped. Because you never bothered to check. You walked out that door and never looked back. He looked down at his hands, shame washing over him. You're right, he admitted. I was a coward. I let my fear and my ambition get in the way of what really mattered. And I've hated myself for it ever since. Naomi shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. Why are you really here, Ethan? What do you want from me? He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. The baby, he said finally. Is it mine? Naomi's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's yours. The world seemed to tilt around him. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. His mind raced as he tried to process her words. He was going to be a father. He had a child on the way, a child he hadn't even known about. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice trembling. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Because I knew you didn't want me, she said. You made that perfectly clear when you left. He remembered the way his friends and colleagues had looked at them when they were together, the whispers and judgment that followed them wherever they went. He had let that judgment dictate his life. Choosing ambition over love, acceptance over integrity. One evening, as they sat in Naomi's small apartment, Ethan finally voiced the thoughts that had been haunting him. I was a coward, he said. His voice heavy with regret. I let other people's opinions control me. I was so afraid of losing everything I had worked for that I didn't realize what I was really losing. Naomi looked at him. Her expression unreadable. And what do you think you've lost, Ethan? You, he said simply. And now, I'm terrified I've lost our child, too. For the first time, Naomi's gaze softened. She didn't say anything, but the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, a tentative connection beginning to form. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. He read parenting books, attended birthing classes with Naomi, and even started setting up a nursery in his apartment. It was strange. As they were assembling a crib together, Naomi paused and looked at him. You're really trying, aren't you? She said, her tone laced with both surprise and curiosity. Ethan looked up from the instruction manual, a small smile on his face. I am, he said. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, Naomi. But I want to do this right. For you. For the baby. She studied him for a moment before nodding. Good, she said. Because this baby deserves better than what we had. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he knew she was right. Do you ever think about what might have been? She asked softly. Every day, he admitted. I think about the life we could have had. The family we could have been. Naomi nodded. Her hand resting on her swollen belly. Me too, she said. But we can't change the past, Ethan. All we can do is try to do better. He reached out and took her hand, his eyes meeting hers. I want to do better, he said. For you. For our child. For us. For the first time, Naomi didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand, a small but significant gesture of hope. As the act ends. Ethan stands on the precipice of a new life. He has taken the first steps toward redemption, but the road ahead is still uncertain. The arrival of the baby will bring new challenges, forcing Ethan and Naomi to confront their past and decide whether they can truly build a future together. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines and the soft murmur of nurses moving in and out. Ethan sat in the corner, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on Naomi. She lay on the hospital bed, her face pale but serene, her breath slow and steady as she rested after hours of labor. In the bassinet beside her lay their daughter, wrapped snugly in a pink blanket. Ethan hadn't moved since the nurse had placed the baby there. He was afraid too. Afraid that if he got too close, the weight of what this moment meant would crush him. Because no matter what, I'm not giving up on us. Not this time. A few weeks later, Ethan decided it was time to take a leap of faith. He had spent months proving himself to Naomi. Will you let me spend the rest of my life making up for the past and building a future with you and Lila? For a moment, Naomi said nothing, her eyes glistening with tears. Then, slowly, she nodded, a radiant smile breaking across her face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Ethan. I will. Lila, who had turned back just in time to see the proposal, let out a delighted squeal and ran to them, throwing her arms around both of them. Does this mean we're going to live together now? She asked, her face lighting up with excitement. Ethan and Naomi laughed, their hearts full. Yes, sweetheart, Naomi said, pulling her close. We're going to be a family. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the same park where Ethan had proposed. Lila served as the flower girl, scattering petals with a wide grin on her face. As Ethan and Naomi exchanged vows, surrounded by their closest friends and family. It felt like the culmination of everything they had fought for, every mistake, every tear, every moment of doubt had led them to this. But their story didn't end there.